Okay, welcome everyone to a guest interview on Breaking the Spell. And for today, we have a very special guest. I'm pleased to welcome a friend of mine who I haven't met in real life actually, and his name is a.pavlotski. I hope I got your pronunciation right. So Alex, thank you so much for coming onto the show at such a odd hour for you, because you're based in Australia and it's midnight for him, whereas we're in Singapore and it's 3 hours before Alex Australian time. So anyway, let me first give Alex a formal introduction first, and then I'll talk casually about how we got to know each other. So Alex is an anthropologist and comic artist from Melbourne, Australia. His first few work was done with comic artists in Japan, and since then he's actually worked to integrate scientific analysis, ethnography, and the medium of comics. His research interests are in comics and visual anthropology, theories of play, movement subcultures, neuro-anthropology, masculinities, intercultural communication, and reactionary identities. Okay, that's quite a mouthful. He is the creator of Parkour Panels, a satirical comic where he discusses relevant issues in the parkour community. Alex earned his PhD in 2016 and has traveled extensively while working on his thesis, traveling with and studying with global parkour communities. He's affiliated with the University of Auckland in New Zealand and La Trobe University in Melbourne. So that's the formal part. But the more interesting part is how did I get to know Alex, even though we haven't met each other. So how it happened was actually on Facebook. Alex was debating with a infamous natural movement parkour guru. I shall not name him for just being civil. They got into a very interesting debate. And at one point, the guru said to Alex, "You're using the abuse of authority or position." And Alex replied back and said, "Authority is a legitimate use of argumentation." And that caught my eye. And I realized that Alex is no mere troll on the social media world. He's actually someone with a very legitimate voice and really sound analysis and interesting commentary on the state of the world, on many contemporary issues that we face today. So the other thing that I've also done with Alex is that Alex has conducted an online anthropology course, an introduction course to anthropology. So I took that up. It was about 6 weeks long, if I'm not wrong. And though I never presented myself, but I was always tuning in and listening in. And it was really fascinating and really interesting. And I will leave space for Alex to advertise his upcoming courses at the end of our conversation. So Alex, the way that we start our channel, right, is that we ask our guests if there's something that they felt was not right with the world, like the first time in their lives. So I want to start with that with you. So share with us something about when was the first time you felt something wasn't right with the world? And it doesn't have to be related to anthropology, but feel free to answer it any way you want.
What an amazingly deep question to start with. Actually, this is probably going to be all the context that you're going to need for me for the rest of the interview. So it's an excellent way to get it going. I think my first sense of understanding not everything is right with the world is in one of my earlier memories, where I would have been about 4 or 5 years old. And I was being told, though not directly, that I am not likely to live past the age of 19. This is super important to me as a formative moment because it defined my conception of how to live my life. There was this very strong drive of take advantage of every moment from that point onwards, and it's very deeply embedded and still is something that I remember. The context of that was, fun fact about me, I'm a Chernobyl kid. So I was born in Pripyat, the town that is adjoined a Chernobyl nuclear power station. And so my family and myself were there when the 1986 accident happened. And I was quite heavily irradiated along with a whole bunch of other people. Fortunately, the doctors that would be regularly assessing everybody who came out of that accident didn't know very much about radiation at the time, and they were wrong. I'm definitely older than 19 years old, even though I carry my age exceptionally well. So that's been something that's been quite interesting for me to adjust to. But that was definitely the first time sitting down and going, okay, I've got a very limited lifespan. What am I going to do with the rest of my life? And then having to reverse that in my now later years with a kid, I'm like, oh, shoot, I have to slow down and stop living as if I might have to expand my life a little bit longer. So yeah, that was probably the big formative moment where we get started from.
did you have any like childhood ambitions, what you wanted to do with your life when you were told that very ominous prophecy?
Yeah, well, actually, no. The effect that it had on me was not that I desired to be a millionaire or an astronaut or whatever in the shortest period amount possible. There was just this broad conception of experiencing as much as I can. It made me into an experiential glutton, which I am to this day. I'm just keen to find experiences and live as fully as possible. So no, and I also had the benefit of, this is former USSR, even before Ukraine was formed as a separate country, sort of being raised by a very staunchly believing communist grandmother. And I haven't taken on her political persuasions. I didn't grow up in that particular environment, but she was fantastic, because one of the benefits of that kind of socialistic worldview was that she always said, look, don't worry about the material stuff. If you're really interested in the intellectual and experiential pursuits, you'll be able to take care of yourself materially. So with that encouragement, I think I've just been trying to get experiences however I could get them.
And
I just have to say, this is the most dramatic context setting of all the guests we've had so far. Yeah, I mean, it would be really incredible to track, like different people who had basically that same diagnosis and see where they are today.
Yeah, and one of the benefits of it was that, for a good long time, the nationalized health system would bring together people who had been through Chernobyl for health testing. So for a good long while, you could actually see the people that you sort of shared this life with, some of whom would get quite badly sick, some of whom would just stop coming, not knowing whether or not they passed away, and others being normal. So yeah, it'll be one of those projects to take on, though a little bit too close to home for me as an anthropologist. I might have to give myself another couple of years before I'm ready to go back and do something that biographical.
Yeah, and speaking of experiences, so we definitely want to jump into the the multitude of experiences you've had as an anthropologist. So before we get into that, right, can you, just for our viewers' sake, perhaps they may not be familiar with what anthropology is, so perhaps you can just give us a simple definition of that. So that's one of the stuff that you can do. And obviously the specialty that you have, which is neuro-anthropology, what the heck is that? And of course, touch base on perhaps the kind of research interest that you've had and some very interesting takeaways.
Sure. So anthropology is, the laziest and broadest definition would be to say it's the study of humanity, which is exhausting and frustrating because isn't everything. So it's not a very satisfying answer. I think the thing that stands out for anthropology, there'd be two major things. One thing that distinguishes anthropology as a study of humanity is, well, first of all, the presumption of comparison. So the idea of going out and experiencing people's life worlds and as much as possible immerse yourself on the basis of it. So the primary tool of anthropological inquiry is the human body and the presumption of self. So you are the tool that puts themselves into these situations and then tries to gather experiential information. The other major thing about anthropology would be that it is deeply, deeply concerned with this question of what it is that makes us so similar by really closely analyzing differences. So traveling out to places, going, okay, we know genetically and biologically that human beings are universally similar, very, very similar, except for the superficial sort of environmental adaptations that we've taken on. So what is it that makes societies so dramatically different, philosophies dramatically different, cultural outlooks dramatically different? And then within those differences, what are the similarities that we can surmise and then bring home with us to be able to actually say, okay, so these are the things that are distinctly human. That's anthropology broadly. And because it's such an open tent, the methodology is largely open. So anthropologists can be trained in forensics, they can be trained in cellular biology, medicine, cultural anthropology, semiotics. Art is definitely considered to be super important. So visual anthropology is a big element of it. I ended up going into neuro-anthropology. So much of my work has been done on a cultural basis, but I've always had an enduring interest in psychology. It was one of the things that I went into university to study before anthropology whisked me away in a completely different direction. So once I completed my undergraduate, I started to see more and more sort of neurological and psychological directions that I wanted to go in. And when I completed my PhD, I did work with parkour people all across the world. One of the things that I found really interesting was the way that the parkour was this fascinating cultural system, but it was also a method of mitigating stress. It was a way of people to interface with these complicated environments. And so that brought me back into a laboratory where we had to do some really fun sort of neurological experiments. And then from that point onwards, I could combine my anthropological work with neuro stuff. Development of identity, development of cognition. These are the things that I get really excited about. And I love it because so much of our perception and cognition is already is almost immediately defined by the cultures and environments that we grow up in. While as if I'm doing neuroanthropology, I acknowledge that, and then we try to dig deeper and say, okay, so how does this impact the brain? What are the channels and thought pathways that are universal even amongst all these differences? So I'm not sure whether or not I did a good job of describing anthropology and neuroanthropology in particular. Does anybody want to throw a follow-up question at me for that?
Angsu, you want to ask something first?
I think I'm good for now. I mean, I definitely want to dig deeper into, neuroanthropology. I mean, I think essentially it's exploring the relationship between culture and the brain, right? So I'm curious how much you've needed to actually understand the medical aspect of the brain. Did you have to actually study the brain physically as part of your discipline?
Absolutely. So there are not very many ways to see thought, but there are ways to see thought behavior patterns, and fMRI scans are fantastic. So if you take a look at, for example, the density of the hippocampus, or one of my favorite, measure the amygdala, you can tell how stressed a person is, what their likely responses are. So those are the kinds of superficial things that you can see right off the bat. But for me, a lot of the biological stuff is enmeshed in cognition. So how we spend glucose, for example, how we use the energy that our brain is putting through, the cycles of thought, the practices of breathing, things like endocrine control functions. All of those are things that we can measure with neuroanthropology. And they're all cultural practices too. One of the things that I love about anthropology, just to mention one more characteristic of it, is that anthropology categorically is very deeply uncomfortable. I wouldn't say categorically, but is really deeply uncomfortable with laboratories. And that's because of its colonial history. So anthropology is one of the few disciplines that has had a very sharp awakening about its own sort of subservient role within colonialization. And part of the reaction was to say, well, one of the things that allow us to be so inhumane historically as a discipline towards people was the fact that we needed to segment them. We wanted to put them in a laboratory and study them as if they were elements within a broader environment. So one of the things that's interesting about anthropology is that anthropology just says, no, okay, instead of putting people in laboratories, what we'll do is we'll try to study them within their own natural environment. And the analogy that's quite often used is anthropology tends to refuse the idea of looking at things through the microscope within an insulation. It tries to look at human beings as elements within a holistic system, almost like a complex biological model. So I love that. And I love the fact that despite the fact that we don't like laboratories, we're allowed to work in them because you can always bring the samples back and still go through that sort of biological analysis. So I love the complexity. I love the fact that it respects life. And look, I'm gushing about my own discipline, so I'll try to stop that.
Well, no, actually, my follow-up question is something that I prepared for you as well. Is when I took up your course on anthropology, I mean, one of the things that I liked about in terms of the research methods is ethnography. A lot of extensive in the field experience, interviewing people, getting immersed in their cultures and their ways of living. And it's an endless field, right? Because you could literally be studying thousands of different cultures out there. So what I'm curious to ask you, Alex, is what useful lessons or life like useful skills or life lessons have you picked up, from studying anthropology in this, in that manner? And has there been anything that's been life-changing from you from studying anthropology?
Definitely. anthropology, when you're entering sort of the postgraduate levels, anthropology is kind of similar to psychology and psychoanalysis. I think that it would not make a very good anthropologist or a very good field worker if there wasn't a certain amount of self-breakdown that didn't happen within ethnography. And the ethnographic method, which is how anthropology gets its information, is to take a person and then send them out into the field. I mean, you prepare them for years, for their entire undergraduate career, for the expectation that their own position is going to strike them as arbitrary. And I think that that's one of those life lessons that my discipline has really given to me. This idea of whatever it is that I believe firmly is potentially just completely culturally constructed. Notions of truth might just turn out to be completely arbitrary. And there's this practice of self. If you were there for the class, so I'm gonna lean on that for a second, but don't worry, viewers, I'm not going to go too deep. This idea of self-deconstruction is a really big element in anthropology. So in order to be able to encompass other people's potential worldviews and to be able to understand that, one of the things that you have to be quite okay with is deconstructing your own essential presumptions. And I think that's wonderful stuff. I also think that we have a word for that in the English language, and that word is trauma, which has been heavily maligned within this particularly productive version of its use. But yeah, that's one thing that I definitely appreciate about anthropology. Anthropology reminds me to not take myself too seriously, because a lot of my foundations are as arbitrary as anybody else's.
Just guys, if you want to jump in, just jump in. Yeah, I can maybe start a question, but just feel free to jump in after me if you want to ask something. So, Alex, I like that you brought this up, because it really tallies with what I want meaning to ask you. And I believe I did correspond with you a little bit on this through email. So basically, my question is this, right? And yeah, right. There exists a plethora of ways that humans have organized societies and express their cultural values. And I'm thinking of examples like, say, monogamy versus polyamory, patriarchy versus matriarchy, egalitarian versus hierarchical societies. And so the thing is that in many public discourses, being human beings, we like to think that our particular way of expressing our culture is the preferred way, or the most natural way, or the most time-tested optimum way of living, organizing our society, right? So what I want to ask you is how you usually address such arguments, and that's one. And two, how would you advise people to, to be more critical, to reflect on their own cultures and their own value systems?
Well, responding to the first part of that, the process of cultural adaptation, the way that we come up with social and cultural systems, is always really deeply saturated with very specific historical and ecological information. So in other words, the places that we create culture in, the places that we grow up in, the people that we communicate with, part of that general ecology, have all sort of pragmatically seeped in to broad scale cultural systems that have been constructed for long periods of time. So this is the absolute genius and brilliance of cultural systems and cultural understandings of learnings, because what you have there is long-term consolidated wisdom communicated through whatever the methodology, whether it's oral traditions or whether it's direct teaching or whether it's written traditions, that are incredibly valuable. Quite often so sophisticated and prolonged that their original utility is hidden. One of the best ways that we can communicate information over a long historical period of time is through storytelling, and we tell stories and we enact ritual practices, and quite often we've forgotten what the actual point of those ritual practices was. So one of the fun acts of being an anthropologist is to sit down and look at the functional and pragmatic components to them. And when I say functional and pragmatic, I don't just mean dietary or best ways to find food. There's also spiritual elements to it too. So how to maintain a society, how to maintain a respect system, how to connect with certain environments, people, practices, etc. So that is really, really important, to respect the depth of knowledge that is often present within cultural systems. But the interesting thing about that is it's also its downfall. When we forget the utility of a practice, we can become, I guess, dogmatic about the way that we deliver that material. So it always comes as a two-sided sort of warning. On one hand is this incredible depth in history that is definitely worth respecting and learning and understanding. But on the other hand is the danger that the tribalistic danger that often comes up with people, which is we just go, we are the right people who have the right ideas and the right decisions about the world. And that becomes all matter of problematic. And we see this tension play out, not within anthropology, but within general society. So traditionalism and conservatism with any social system versus young people coming in and pushing for conceptions of change is always a fairly significant point of tension. Yeah, I love that stuff. That's the stuff that anthropology really gets into. How do we look out? Well, I guess we should consistently try to ask ourselves the question, why? But that is, to me, that's a very mealy-mouthed thing to say, because cultural systems, our language, like just as an example of a cultural system, language is a cultural system. The ecology that we grew up in, the diet, the people that we are in, are so foundational to who we are that quite often we don't see them. We are like the fish in water. We're not able to articulate its presence. So on one hand, I'd like to say, hey, try to be aware of the arbitrary nature of your traditions, and please try to engage with the notion of transformation and change in a productive way. But that's wishful thinking, because quite often for us to realize that we're functioning in accordance to a fairly historically specific series of conditions is an existential crisis for us. Like, that realization alone is overwhelming for a lot of people. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to moderate my answer and say, don't keep an eye on it, but do your best. Do your best to try to catch yourself on the moments where you end up following arbitrary rules, just simply because you don't have an alternative for it. The big word that anthropologists use for this is ethnocentrism. And ethnocentrism can be an intentional conscious strategy, but quite often it's simply the, for lack of a better word, the software that your hardware is running on. Your sense of self and identity is defined ethnocentrically, quite often because we don't have an alternative.
Yeah, I'm actually thinking of a good example to give to our viewers, because just in case they get lost in the abstract explanations that we're giving. Like, a good example to me is, and I just had this conversation this morning with a friend of mine. So his wife has given birth to a new kid, and within the Chinese culture, there's supposed to be this ritual of the mom not being able to shower for 30 days, if I'm not wrong, post-birth. And it's just a kind of an anachronistic tradition. It's just there because it's just assumed that the mom is better off not showering for the next 1 month. And I kind of remember that, at least in my experience with my ex-wife, I mean, she found that pretty illogical. I mean, she understood why many Chinese elderly Chinese mothers still hold on to that belief, and they have very, very strong convictions that this should be upheld. Not to mention also the kind of foods that a new mother should have to consume, like, after birth. So and these things are not held with I mean, these beliefs are held without any sense of, like, what's the scientific basis behind it. So yeah, I was just wondering also, in your case, in your cultures, can you identify some examples like this?
Well, the big one would be language. The way that we frame and articulate ourselves and our understanding of the world is already framed by a series of grammatical structures that have been passed on through a particular cultural line. So sometimes we're not able to communicate ideas simply because we literally lack the cultural vocabulary to be able to present them. And that's a really powerful line. It's sticky, because trying to get across that stuff is, when you don't have the words, is exceptionally difficult, which is why it gets all manner of exciting. It's why we love studying dance. It's why I love doing parkour, because parkour is one of those things that allows you to communicate outside of a vocabulary, and is a wonderful example of people cross-culturally sort of bonding on something that we all share, which is the human body. Another example of that is, so food, you mentioned before. I quite like that idea. And we think of food as subsistence. But food is also wonderfully psychotropic. I mean, different types of food that we will actually transform your mood. They'll also transform the way that you feel and the way that you move. And all of these things really matter. So diets can actually feed into notions of attitudes. If you feel a particular way, maybe it's something as simple as your diet or your particular biomic structure. By the way, don't try to completely change your diet, because it's always very difficult to do. But if you simply let yourself do something like get hungry and record your mood, it's wonderful stuff to do with. And this is where sort of the neuro part comes in, Because one of the things that we know from neuroscience that really complements this conception of cultural difference is our conception of a consistent self is largely a delusion. Most of our cognitive decisions are made within states of arousal, within states of relaxation, within states of pain, within states of whatever. And our decisions are tangibly transformed by the physical condition, the environmental conditions that we're in. And then usually afterwards, we'll sit down and we'll go, oh yeah, no, I made that decision completely consciously, entirely consistently with everything that I always believed in. But that is what you'd call a post hoc explanation. So we could talk about things like traditional practices, and that's generally sort of the more obvious sort of direction to go in when it comes to cultural influence. But things like language and food, things that we don't even think about as expression of cultural values, are really powerful in terms of the way that they set our behavior and mood.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, I'm a health trainer, and this is one of those topics that I also feel can get a bit touchy, because when you want someone to perhaps adopt a healthier lifestyle, then there obviously has to be some hard talk on changing dietary habits, and at the same time, you want to respect the choice, the kind of cuisine that people choose to have, especially since say if someone has their parents cooking for them, then it would be really offensive if you were to say, oh mom, what you're cooking is not really good for us, and you need to have really hard discussions about this, and it's not easy to maneuver around topics like this. Guys, anything you want to ask?
Yeah, no, I'm just, I think what you've been talking about is just the power of anthropology as a lens with which to question our own culture and our own norms. But I do wonder, for like the vast majority of people out there, whether they are still stuck in this idea of anthropology as a field that studies, I don't know, primitive people, or like that exoticizes, I don't know, you just see the National Geographic pictures, right, of people in Africa, and I still do wonder in this 21st century if that's what a lot of people think of anthropology as, rather than this field that could potentially like throw you into an existential crisis. But I think, one of my favorite examples of sort of turning that lens in towards yourself is the concept of weird psychology. So, it's been revealed that like so many psychological studies which seem to show, okay, this is how humans universally think, and this is, conventional rationality and everything. Yeah, it's been shown that, most of these studies were conducted on college students, right? So, and they are white, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And it's actually a very small minority of people who fit that category. And so it's, I love that label because it is a total flip of what people normally think. People normally think, oh, everyone out there is weird, I'm normal. But then, yeah, here's this case of people who were called normal, but they're the ones who are weird. Yeah, just wondering what your comment on that is.
I love that paper. That's a fantastic paper, and a good book too. I think the book's come out not too long ago. But that's exactly the kind of thing that anthropology, specifically neuroanthropology, seeks to challenge. Because the idea, so I love psych, and I keep up with the journals. I'm very excited. I enjoy the neuro and the psychological side, but psychology is often ethnocentric right out of the box. There's a series of characteristic presumptions that are based on very westernized American European sort of conceptions of value that then seek to measure and impose sort of normality upon the population. Meanwhile, we have a world filled with amazing difference, and it just hurts my feelings, along with every other neuroanthropologist who's ever existed, that our presumption of a sample of humanity is this tiny slither of college students, and for the laziest reasons, because they're right there outside of the laboratory. You can recruit them and almost immediately available. But yeah, it is a very bad way to measure normality in humanity. It's not representative of the full spectrum at all. And anthropology has been aware of that for a while. I think that it's really quite important that people do still maintain that connection. I think one of the things that I appreciate about my discipline is that it has a lot of experience being humbled. And when people say, don't you study exoticized people somewhere in the world, I think that that's always a reminder for the ethnographer to bring it down a few notches. Because quite the first reaction I have to that is, well, you know, what defines exoticism? There's plenty of exoticism right here in the backyard. There's crazy people all over the place. It's great, we can study them. But I think that humbling history is a good thing. I think that having to explain to people that the exotic is no longer the exotic and the laboratory isn't the way that we imagined it to be is a good humbleness exercise for most anthropologists.
So that being said,
people
right?
always assume that we're forensics too, because Bones has anthropologists in it, and I just think that we study bodies, which some of us do. I just haven't done too much of that myself. Sorry, go ahead, Douglas.
Oh, no worries. No, I was going to say, because, you know, we're now hitting like one of the crucial, what would you call it, like the principles about anthropology, which is how culturally malleable human beings can be, right? And I was thinking also in the case of, in one of your courses, you brought up the idea of medical anthropology and how that particular discipline has shown legitimate criticisms of the Western biomedical model and how it ignores cultural, ecological, and political factors. But nevertheless, right, like, and this is something kind of like for me to tease you on. You know, you posted on Facebook very recently about how COVID-19, right, it has actually detrimental effects on brain gray matter. And, you know, like, to me, there's also a illustration of how the biological also cannot be denied. And what I'm curious to ask you about is, how do you weigh such variables, right? You got the medical or the biological factors, you got cultural, ecological, and the political as well. And like, this is a challenge to you, right? You can meet people who say that, you know, COVID-19 isn't serious, and that person can approach it from a phenomenological angle and say, well, I didn't feel sick when I had COVID-19, and I just think that the way people perceive the risks of COVID-19 is socially constructed, for example.
Well, broadly speaking, within anthropology, well, personally, because it's not always within anthropology, personally, I think that the cultural and the biological have never been truly separated. I think the biomedical model is incredibly good at acute care in cases of damage, because it treats the human body as a mechanical machine, and it's incredibly potent to be able to intervene and fix a mechanical issue. But in everyday non-pathologized functions, so when there isn't something wrong with us, when we're not hurt, we are not interacting with the world as a machine that is interacting with the ecology. It is inside of us and we are inside of it. And there's this constant flow and exchange that's happening. So for me, understanding the biological processes that generate things like the placebo effect or the nocebo effect is really key for me to be able to study the cultural conception of magic. Because those biological, biomedical realities are at play when it comes to things like curses, when it comes to things like enchantment. So the anthropologist has to look at the whole thing as a constant fluctuating, complex and moving system. So that's not the kind of thing that I would generally separate. I wouldn't just say medicine goes here and culture goes here. In relation to COVID, see, that's tricky, because what we're talking about is a complex series of personalized beliefs. And maybe the person who you're talking to who doesn't want to take precautions actually understands the risks and is able to mitigate them. Maybe they're biomedically trained. Maybe they're planning on staying away from people who are vulnerable. Maybe they've taken the statistical chance and said, I'm pretty healthy, my immune system is in a fairly good place, I should be able to overcome this. That's the best case scenario. But just as likely, there's a strong possibility there that this person hasn't come to grips with the reality of COVID. And that's one thing that I've seen over and over and over again. People confronted with information that, and look, I'm just going to keep teasing this topic, that is traumatic, because I really think that we should use trauma in a much more expanded kind of way. People coming to terms with information that is so challenging to their entire perceptual understanding of reality, are always faced with two choices, which is, do I choose to sit down and take the time to reshuffle my conceptualization of the world, which is a momentous task to accept the reality. The world no longer looks the way that you imagined it to be, to then have to learn about this new complicated world, very, very threatening and very energy intensive and requires soul searching and reconceptualization of your own life. Or you can just go, that's not real. And that we've seen a lot of that with COVID. I think that a lot of denialism has, and it's funny because this may seem like a reductive thing, but that's actually what people are saying. When you see people who are denying it, they'll just go, oh, it's just not that bad. Or they'll just flat out deny the veracity of the virus. They'll just be like, no, it's really not a big thing. So what you have there is much more complicated. What you have there is somebody who is being faced with an existential reformation of the way that they need to live the world. And they're just taking the, nope, I'm just going to ignore that card out of that situation. How do you talk to that person? Very gently. I know a few, and the best that you can do is just say, and I've had to do this with a friend of mine who doesn't want to face up to COVID, who would deny it and doesn't want to get vaccinated. And I just say, I love you, man, and I respect you, but you're wrong on this one. And I'm happy to talk to you at any given point. But I know that if I push that, it's just going to kick off a bunch of defense mechanisms, because that's what we're good at. Our psyches don't like being completely reconfigured. So there's always a million defenses that come up the second that threat is right there.
Yeah, I actually, well, I didn't expect to have to bring this up now, but I actually had such a conversation with a friend of mine as well, which just happened a few days ago. And, I want to keep the privacy of the conversation, but essentially I did also probe my friend to just think a little bit deeper into her biases, in terms of why she had to feel she had to dig up vaccine misinformation in order to defend her views about not getting vaccinated. And I hope that, by following the same kind of advice as you just preached, which is just to try to coax and talk gently and just instigate critical thinking, perhaps that person can reconsider her views. But anyway, Alex, let's talk about trauma. One of our pet topics, especially with Santosh. So earlier, actually, when we first interviewed Santosh, he gave like a, he was interviewed on the topic of trauma. So for viewers, if you want to get some information on that, you can look at our interview with Santosh. But let's get straight into the guru, Gabor Mate, who is the key person in talking about trauma. And maybe I'll just start this with your comments, Alex. So I have it written down. This is what you wrote on Facebook. I'm a little bit worried about people misunderstanding the implications of healing, and there's a faith healing aesthetic to the second part of the film. I think he suggests that trauma leads to behaviors that cause illnesses, which I think is right, but people might assume that trauma manifests illnesses magically. The cancer arc makes me uncomfortable, as does the idea of an internal authentic self. Still, and then you ... So I was wondering, perhaps to kickstart a conversation, perhaps you can just elaborate on your comments. And, Santosh, just feel free to jump in and have a hearty exchange.
Well, the bit that, so this is after I saw the documentary. I think that was just a little bit earlier this year. That was on the topic of trauma. And there were elements of that I really like. I'll open up with this. I think that trauma so within the field of cognition, broadly, I think that we've really done ourselves a tremendous disservice by picking the word trauma to name trauma, because we took it flat out of medical practice. The idea of a traumatic impact, the idea of traumatic injury, is the idea of a devastating blow that causes massive shock within an organism that requires healing and reconfiguration. And so when we talk about trauma in the Western world, this history really lingers over the top of it all. There's a long history of denial because trauma was connected to wars. I don't know how much we want to go into that stuff. For a while there, the nation state didn't want to acknowledge that trauma existed. It just said, the official institutions for a long time said, trauma is just weak people not being able to cope. It doesn't exist amongst the strong. So it's a character malfunction or deformity. So there's all of this horrible baggage that we've attached to trauma. But when you look at trauma for what it is a penetrative, deeply transformative experience that is imposed upon a person from the outside world. I can't think of an example of trauma that doesn't follow that pattern. Some kind of massive event has transpired, or possibly a massive event has transpired over a prolonged period of time, such as compound trauma incidences. And what that does is it places whatever that event at the center of your cognition. It becomes a central reference point that you kind of can't help but touch every single time that you think or do anything. So when it's debilitating, trauma can keep people from being able to do a whole bunch of things. When it's integrated, one of the things that you see is that people will always see the world through the lens of that particular experience. And that sounds horrible, until you realize that almost every culture in the world has got experiences that are specifically set up to impose trauma on its own initiatives. So we have tremendous archives. Like almost every cultural system has a rite of passage, an initiation, or some kind of ritual that would, by all terms that we've got available to us, impose trauma upon its own members of the community. And so for me, this is really telling, because within the Western tradition, particularly sort of West European sort of psychoanalytic stuff, there's this strong commitment to the idea of you as an essential soul, like an essence. It's Christian largely, but also has a whole bunch of other connections. So there's this idea that we are born a certain way and we shall carry on that authentic self throughout the entirety of our life. And a lot of people in the Western world are deeply committed to this idea. And so trauma is an event that removes you from yourself. That's what it is. It's transformative. Trauma is transformative. So coming from that history and coming with the associations, trauma is treated as the worst thing that could ever happen to you, because trauma can come along. It is something from the outside that can change you, that can take you away or deviate you from what might be considered to be your essential self. So existential horror and dread, we're so scared of this idea. But when we look outside of that very narrow range of tradition, one of the things that we see is trauma is implemented in exactly that, but for the positive. So rites of passage that transform children from adults, or children into adolescents, into adults, into men or women, or whatever it is that their social role becomes, into leaders, into warriors, into craftsmen. They're traumatic traditions. And the whole point of them is to take you away from who you were. So there's this incredible utility in this transformative power. And when you take a traumatic event and you couple it with societal recognition, what you have is one of the most brilliant mechanisms for identity constructions that I could ever think of. So what we did was we came up with this incredible system. And when I say we, I mean humanity at large, almost everywhere around the world, in which we could say, all right, now we need a clear transition so that we have a purpose within this social group and social role. We're going to initiate a rite of passage that is going to be, almost always follows a series of very specific steps that include the removal from society, some level of stigmatization or lost identity of self, and then reintegration. Some of these are extreme, things like bungee jumping, things like really, really deadly hunting rituals, all that kind of stuff. Some of them are ritualized, so less extreme. And what will happen is at the end of that, we recognize and welcome the new identity that comes out of this rite. And what happened was that people would go through them and then they would go, all right, well, now I know what I am. And there's this very strong sort of role-based, not that existential questioning doesn't continue, but there's this strong comfort in this notion of a transformed notion of self. While as, industrialization has really spread this model around, but that Western conception of a traumatic experience doesn't allow for that transformation. So one of the things that we see that's pretty much epidemic in the modern world is this really weird discomfort about who we are, this desire to, on one hand, hold on to some kind of essential self that we're always going to be, but at the same time, perform different versions of ourselves to different people. And that's a really complicated task that we've put ourselves into because we've put trauma in the very, very scary box and have gotten rid of a lot of the rituals that would place it within our sort of social structures. And the price that we pay for it is ongoing existential dis-ease. And when I say dis-ease, I mean not ease, but I mean, you could argue inflammation comes from stress. And that sort of leads me to the second part of your question. I 100% agree that it is the potential for self-healing through things like placebo effects is not utilized sufficiently. We are just now, and there's publication flurry. So there's books coming out after books about the way that we can use meditation to control inflammation, the way that we can get to know ourselves and our community and find our place within society to control all kinds of physiological effects. But at the same time, I have enough of the medical training in me to say, let's not get too carried away with that. So I see, whenever I see a narrative in which things like the acceptance of trauma will get somebody over cancer, I'm pretty sure that it probably would have helped with their recovery, but I wouldn't recommend replacing cancer treatment for it. Like that, so it's very important for me to make that statement.
Yes, Alex, I just had a question on something that I personally am vested in is the way society treats its most marginalized and it's most discriminated against, and how we shape social policies or our criminal justice system or our economic policies around the marginalized or people who we don't deem as normal in our society. So by marginalized in Singapore, I'm concerned with people who are low-income communities or low-wage workers in our midst, or persons with disabilities, and how culture shapes our view of these people. In Singapore particularly, I think there's quite a fair amount of colonial inheritance that we have, and a lot of this has got to do with the notions of productivity, right? So we judge the worth of a person in our society based on how productive they can be from the economic sense. And indigenous wisdom, shows otherwise. Actually, marginalized communities are very important and valuable signals to the in-group that something is wrong and we need to bring them in as an act of homeostasis or as an act of rebalancing. Yeah. Whereas in the social policies that we've designed in Singapore, or economic policies or the criminal justice system, it's based on this whole idea of social Darwinism, that the weak will slowly fade out through the system, and the poor are lazy. So I'm just interested in understanding like what I've learned in indigenous tribes is the whole concept of Ubuntu in Africa, right? Like I am because we are. We start to see marginalized people as ourselves, and we don't have a society that becomes so individualistic or competitive and that wants to isolate marginalized communities, but we try to include them in all aspects of our educational, social policy, or even economic policy. Yeah, so they are no longer seen as people or problems to be fixed, but rather assets in our communities that needs to be harnessed, signals that needs to be harnessed. They're very valuable people in our society. Whereas in Singapore, I have a sense that they are not as valuable as people in the ruling or political elite class. And yeah, I don't know, how do we go about having a shift in our entire societal consciousness so that we start to bear in mind the lived experiences of such people and the tremendous amount of suffering and marginalization that they go through, or trauma that they go through? And how do we start to see that actually our actions on social policy or economic policy or even criminal justice system has a tremendous effect on the minds, the well-being of such communities, which is not humane at all. Yeah, so that's one thing I'm particularly concerned about.
Yeah, and look, this is a massive problem. Like it's one of those major issues that you encounter almost everywhere. And it's the result of a long-standing historical process that was always hyper-utilitarian. Like the process of building a nation it's amazing how infrequently we sit down and think about it as a pragmatic project. And it was not long ago at all. I mean, the idea of a contemporary nation state is 400 years old if we're generous. And one of the things that people did was they turned around and they said, well, how do we overcome the following problems? And the problems were too many languages, can't create a nation state if people can't talk to each other, too many separate traditions, and not enough not enough sense of internal unity. And it's a really hard balancing act, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to create a story that unifies people by the hundreds of thousands, while as still maintaining very strong boundaries. And that's really scary, because a combination of a utilitarian process has ended up with, here we are 400 years down the line, we created technologies that were supposed to improve all of our lives. Technologies like the economy. That's a technology that we created to improve. I mean, the economy is a cultural system of trade that's designed to maximize outcomes for everybody. But we've reached a point where we now can turn around and say, well, we can't afford to offer healthcare, we can't afford to offer education or other benefits because we can't provide them because it would damage the economy. Now, that, if we go back to the original intent, that's ass backwards. Like, how do you come up with a technology that's supposed to improve people's lives and then turn around and say, well, now we have to start sacrificing people's lives to this technology? So that's one thing that's driving this process, where marginalization happens on the basis of utility and value, and we're still acting like we're building this nation, which I guess it has to be an ongoing project. Otherwise, we'd all realize that nations are fairly arbitrary constructs. Somebody drew some lines somewhere. The other big component is that it feeds heavily into existing tribalistic human tendencies. We like being comfortable and secure in our identity. And unfortunately, one of the easiest shortcuts to feeling comfortable and secure in our identity is by defining ourselves against others. And when we define ourselves against others, we prescribe negative characteristics to those who are not us. And you see that with marginalized groups everywhere. And one of the big horrible sort of results of this is that when you have communities that are about subsistence, when you have communities that are about, for example, ecological embeddedness. So if you have a community that says, we are interested in returning to our ecology, nature is our mother, father, deity, et cetera, those people aren't interested in competing in the same way as the people who have the utilitarian project. So what you see is this really powerful wave where the utilitarian project just sort of sweeps aside anybody who doesn't want to participate in it. And it's interesting too, because when you go to the marginalized communities, and when you get through the justified anger and resentment that's quite often there in the community, one of the things that you see is traditions that don't necessarily push for utility, that push for something outside of that. And that's when we talk about this incredible gift of Indigenous wisdom. Australian Aboriginal people is a brilliant example of that. Treated as if they were subhuman by the scientific establishment for 100 years, and then badly abused by the colonial nation state for the entirety of Australia's existence. And, you know, what do we know? We know that they have a story in their mythology that perfectly traces the arrival of human populations in Australia as far as 54,000 years ago. And we just didn't acknowledge that for a very long time, because how could these people have something that's incredibly historically accurate? But you sit down and you look at the practices and you go, well, these people have been really deeply concerned with charting the land and its history for a very, very long period of time. So that's an example of the wonderful stuff that we get when we engage with those communities. How do you get people to engage with the community? Well, you have to start with making the nation state less pragmatically oriented. And good luck with that, because politicians aren't particularly interested in that kind of conversation. How do you start it in a population? Well, you start it by cohabiting people together. That's the most effective way so far. Close interaction with lots of different groups of people is a fantastic way to start to break down things. Sharing of food, sharing of internal wisdom is fantastic stuff, but that's fickle. That's one of the things that I learned while studying reactionary ideologies. You can startle people into behaving in the most inhumane possible ways. And we might be seeing some of that around coronavirus, around all the stuff that's been happening in the last couple of years. So if I had a direct solution to that problem, I would be very, very, very excited to put it into practice. But it's quite complicated and very heavily sort of cultural and ecologically dependent.
Yeah. Just to add on to that, like if I could ask, what are some very sophisticated cultural practices of indigenous tribes or indigenous wisdom One thing I heard about the way they organize criminal justice systems, it's not centered on punitive or retributive justice, but rather restorative or rehabilitative or transformative justice system. So whenever there is a criminal act, the entire community convenes together and introspects on the underlying root causes that led to that criminal act, but not in castigating the person who committed a criminal act. That is punitive in nature, but they go even deeper and they ask themselves within the community, how do we even allow this to happen as a community? Or yeah, so this is like just one practice, right? Whereas in our society, we tend to make scapegoats out of criminals, but not understanding the entire ecological or cultural substratum that led to the biomedical diagnosis. This is a criminal, we need to fix this person and eliminate this person, isolate this person, because that breeds further trauma. The person has resentment, the person comes back to society after imprisonment, becoming more resentful and committing more crimes. And so that's a vicious cycle, which is negative. But in the indigenous wisdom, it's virtuous, it's transformative, it's healing, both for the victims and for the victimizer. So are there any other, like, I don't know, in your journey as a anthropologist, anything about indigenous wisdom that has caught your eye that you would like to share with the viewers here?
Yeah, and it's important to say, I mean, indigenous punishments or conception of sanction vary. So there's capital punishment, but then there's also these incredible alternative forms as well. I've got a couple of favorites, but one of the big ones that really struck me as fascinating is related to this reconceptualization of trauma in cognitive anthropology, and it comes from, the particular case study comes from Senegal, but there's tons of this kind of practice happening across Africa. Also, sections of South and Southeast Asia, sections of what is the Stadi region, like it happens everywhere, and that is the conception of ownership. So when you have a person in your social group or society, there is this conception that they belong to you, but they are also the responsibility of the collective self. So the way that I came across this, and I quite love it, was by reading after the major revolution in South Sudan, where there was a serious civil conflict. There was a series of spills where the United Nations provided psychologists to go and deal with people who were supposedly traumatized by these conflicts. And I'm sure they were. They were seeing horrible stuff, ethnic cleansing and all that kind of stuff. And the community got together and kicked them out. It ran them out on a rail and they explained it. They said, you are horrible people. Why in the world would I want to sit with you, a total stranger, in an isolated room, away from family, away from community, away from sunlight, and rehash the horrible things that happened to me? What kind of evil is this that you guys are trying to perpetuate on us? And all of this became a point of study. And what came out quite quickly was that conceptions of trauma, conceptions of bad alienation and injury were actually met by the community as members of the community were taken in and reappropriated. So there's this idea of, yeah, you went through this horrible thing, you're not the same. But that's okay. We see you, we acknowledge you, and as a community, we'll create a space for you to occupy. This new version of you is going to be welcomed in. And that's fantastic stuff. Like, that's really, really powerful stuff. Instead of creating really complicated systems of treatment and care that communicate that we care about every single person in public health and all this wonderful stuff. Simultaneously, what we do is we meet people who have been broken or challenged or hurt, and we say to them, well, we've given you help now, off you go. The rest of it is your responsibility. While as in so many indigenous practices, this idea of your pain is our responsibility and our responsibility to reintegrate you back into society is an incredible gift. Like, that is a social system worth emulating. But it's not efficient. It's just humane. So what do you do with that? I love that. I love that kind of stuff. This idea of belonging to a community and that community taking responsibility for you. And I mean, we see that. We've still got cliches, like people say, there's a village and everybody knows the town drunk and the town blacksmith and the town whatever. But the fact that there's a label The fact that people made a space for the alcoholic within their community and still treat them as if they exist and they matter, even as they poke fun of them, is so much more humane than what we do within contemporary medicine, which is just to say, you have an affliction, you are either going to be terribly broken for the rest of your life, or you're going to go off and fix yourself. That seems really harsh to me. So I'm not sure whether or not I'm babbling. Does that respond to the question?
Oh, that's amazing. Ansu, yeah.
Yeah, no, I just want to say I completely agree with you there. I once, I think, saw a very powerful talk, a TED talk by a woman in India who had an organization that was working with young girls who had been raped or gang raped. And she said, actually, the worst thing was that, no one wanted to take these girls in. That was, it was a very dramatic statement she made, but I think she said the fact that they were now outcasts of that society was far worse than the actual rape that they suffered to begin with. I also want to just go back to what you were saying about how lots of rites of passage are these things that are forced on people to reconfigure them for a positive end. Then that's completely mind-blowing. I never thought about it that way, and I'm still pondering that. And it is true. In our modern society, we've completely cast trauma in a very negative light. And I am wondering, in what ways could we actually think of a traumatic process as having a positive effect? And I'm still thinking about that. So just wanted to appreciate this completely new sort of light you're helping me think of trauma in.
For me, this is quite direct. The simplest way to do it would be to ritualize it. And it's interesting. When we experience trauma in the sort of Western medical sense, one of the things that makes the injuries so deep and so permanent is the uncontrollable nature of it. You are inflicted upon by something usually way, way outside of yourself. Car accident, assault, some kind of big violent thing happens to you with no cause. Ritualized processes of trauma are inflicted on you by the society. There is a clear group of people. And it's interesting because, our natural reaction towards that is to get defensive, to be like, well, how dare they? Why would they do this to me? I was good as they are. But that sense of purpose combined with the reintegration phase, so combined with being welcomed as you come back from this identity destroying, because that's the point of it. It's an identity destroying process. And you're given an identity to replace the one that you previously had that is upheld by your community. That takes so much of the sting out of the uncontrollable nature of this thing that has ruined you as you previously were. And when you put it that way, it's highly utilitarian. The one place where the Western world and much of the industrialized world still utilizes traumatic experience is the military. That is still 100% classically ritualized, purpose-imposed trauma. That's its function. It's to create a new identity for the recruit to make them more capable of serving within this particular function. So it's not like we don't know. And it's not like we're not aware that this traumatic process can be really positive when it comes to bonding people with their community, can be really positive when it comes to generating an identity that they previously didn't have. It's highly utilitarian, but we only use it in that sense when we want to train people to go out and point guns at other people. We very rarely use it. And then it becomes the case study that just blows the conception of trauma off the wall, because then you have these people coming back. Once they've served their time in the military, they return and they've embraced this identity that they've received in the military. And quite often they're re-traumatized by their return. Because then we turn to them and we say, great, you've served your time, you've been honorably discharged, whatever. Now go back to being normal. And the amount of damage and anger and resentment that causes in many people who are veterans is just immeasurable, because it's like first of all, they've accepted who they were through this transformative process. They've been told to be proud of it. So they don't have that sense of desire to return that somebody who might have been assaulted or gone through a car accident would have. And yet they're being told, that's it. We no longer have a need for this identity of yours. Get back to civilian life. And it's absurd. Like it's mental health destroying horrible stuff. And it's usually at that point that we see things like substance abuse go up, risk of suicide go up, self-harm goes up, all of these things are there. So I think that even these examples that we don't have to go to fascinating faraway historical or geological places, they demonstrate the way that trauma actually has a utility, and trauma is a form of learning. And that's what I would place it. It's a very high impact form of learning that penetrates. It's not learning on the superficial level. It's not like picking up a geographical fact or a name or a piece of information. It's learning about yourself. It's debasing your own understanding of the world, which is an identity crisis. But could be productive or could be horrible.
Yeah, actually, now that you mentioned this, especially regarding the military, this segues into our other theme for tonight, which is masculinity. So, Alex, you've always written a lot on this topic. So I just want to start the conversation on this with an update in Singapore, where we have the president of a women's rights group. So the group's called AWARE. And they've actually drawn attention to the concept of toxic masculinity. And the president of this group actually focused on the mandatory conscription service that we have in Singapore, and how also the phenomenon of bullying in schools, and that society, in this case, she's referring to Singapore, can develop a healthier idea of masculinity. And Alex, you yourself have very close encounters with neo-Nazis and far-right communities. So I guess just to start the conversation, how should we even talk about masculinity as a concept? And, is there like a essentialist quality to it? Or is it like more relative, more flux? And what can anthropology actually demonstrate or tell us in this regard?
Masculinity, I mean, along with femininity and various other forms of performance, is really, really interesting because it is simultaneously a series of cultural and social constructions. And there's a level of biological sort of self-presentation that's in there too. So neurologically, there is some difference between what we would consider to be, I mean, the whole thing is on a spectrum, but you would have far feminine and far masculine sort of brains on either side. And one of the things that defines masculinity, and this is one of those cross-cultural things, is that, well, I'm sorry, gentlemen, but our brains take a really long time to mature. 25 is most of the way through the maturation process. That's where we call the cutoff for masculine brain development. And the bits that are maturing have got to do with a lot of executive function. What does that mean? Does it mean that we're all stupid up until we're 25? Probably, but that's not really what the point is. The point is, what this does is it really heavily emphasizes the desire for performance, for a space and a performance, particularly among men. And this is quite interesting. Men get very, very easily antsy about not having a role and a purpose to fulfill, because there's this identity construction process that's going, it's neurologically sort of urged and driven. Simultaneously, we've got scripts. And some of these scripts do things like highlight the aggression and the sort of bad executive function decisions that we have during this period of time, or some of them downplay them. So this is the curious thing about culture. So some forms of masculinity are about poise and maintaining good positioning and good face and not losing control, while as other forms are exactly the other way around. Like, this is the time where we start war and we go over the mountain and we take their goats and whatever it is that people do in particular structures. So it's interesting. There is this massive amount of leeway in terms of how we channel this biological process, but the biological process underneath it is still very present and is present cross-culturally. So there's this really sort of interesting interplay happening between the two things. Having said that, the cultural element is just so much more pronounced. So you can recreate and sublimate the biological component. You can make women go through a toxic masculinity sort of encouraging cultural group, and then you'll start to see those behaviors coming up. So clearly it's not biologically deterministic. The cultural element has got a lot to say here. In fact, I'd say probably more than the biological element. But the two of them do play hand in hand. And if we deny that, we risk stuff, because the savvy recruiters of young men for various causes are taking advantage of exactly that, both cultural narratives and that biological imperative.
But that being the case, right? Like, what is exactly toxic masculinity? So that's one. And two, because we were talking about the cultural element and how various communities have devised, have designed different rituals on this, right? I'm wondering, like, is this concept of toxic masculinity just something that we have conceptualized within modern democracies? Is it not something you would not find in the indigenous community or a community or society of a different sort, like pre-modern societies?
Well, I think that they would be present, depending on sort of the strictures of the society that you're functioning in. The thing that makes toxic masculinity toxic isn't necessarily the toxic behavior that it can cause. The thing that makes toxic masculinity toxic is when the role of masculinity becomes so tight and constrictive that it becomes damaging to the person who is internalizing that identity. So if a good example of toxic masculinity is conceptions of, for example, gesturing. So men will train themselves out of using their hands as they speak because it's not masculine. And this is just an arbitrary example, but is it positive to limit your expression in that particular way? And what does it come with? Well, quite often it comes with a constant sense of self-regulation where people will suppress emotions. And that's absolutely classic example of toxic masculinity. Toxic because the prescription says, we don't want you to emote in a particular way. Well, what is the acceptable way of emoting? Well, the acceptable way of emoting within Western toxic masculine conceptions is aggression. So you can't cry, you can't get too enthusiastic, you can't be too nerdy, but you sure as hell can get pissed off. And so what you see is this sort of channeling and this transformation of entire swaths of society from being fully capable, expressive human beings to a performance of masculinity that is deemed appropriate by the culture. And that's toxic. So that's the constrictive nature of toxic masculinity. Same thing can be said for toxic femininity. It doesn't matter which, as long as it's tight, restrictive, and is doing damage to the person who's living with those values. Sorry, I forgot the second half part of the question. Sorry, I got so into
just whether
toxic masculinity.
Also whether in your research or from what you do know, is this something that's a relatively modern phenomenon, or are we talking about, so do you see this, for example, in pre-modern societies or say indigenous communities, because we were just on that topic just now?
So yes, so again, we're talking about the plethora of human experience. So yes, it definitely does happen in indigenous communities, particularly when you have, so the version of masculinity that we currently have, and so industrialized masculinity, is another one of those things that's related to simple problem solving in relation to nation states. Why does industrialized masculinity look the way that it does? Well, because in an industrialized society, you're supposed to have men who are, for the large part, working horrible factory jobs that they absolutely hate because it's brainless, exhausting, silly work. So what do? Well, you come up with a model of masculinity that makes them more resilient when it comes to that kind of stuff. So what do? You say, a man's job is to provide for his family, to be stoic and to clench his jaw, to not complain and not grumble about the things that he has to do as part of the process. And every once in a while, we'll let him blow off steam, primarily by drinking and getting angry. So when we're talking about this stuff, like it's silly and reductionist, but rewind time and look at the system within which that version of masculinity was being built. And that's not a caricature. That's exactly what they were looking for. Alcoholism across the industrialized world was huge because urbanization and substance abuse go hand in hand. Everywhere you get urbanization, you have this incredible explosion of toxic consumption. You have labor that does not want to live in a horrible urban environment and go to a factory every single day. So you literally have to tell them a story. And it's amazing how arbitrary, like when you put it down this way, the current idea of what a manly man is actually what in the 1700s would have been an ideal factory worker and soldier. And of course that's toxic because we don't work in factories. We don't behave that way, but But turn around 200-300 years worth of cultural conditioning. It's taken for granted that that's simply the profile of masculinity in many cultures now, which is just not true. And then you start looking cross-culturally and you see examples of masculinity that is a lot more nurturing and expressive, that is a lot more interested in immediate family values. And yet simultaneously, you do still see the consistency of warrior and hunting practices that are quite heavily masculine. So the range is huge, but yeah, there is and I mean, the big thing at the end of the day that's often attributed to this is the reason why men are warriors and hunters is because at some point, most women will have a baby and that complicates things for them. But it's so much more interesting and nuanced when you get down to the ground level and look at stuff case by case, because we're trying to solve problems around some very loose biological parameters with like environmental and state projects and cultural histories all playing at the same time.
Yeah, I will also want to share with our viewers something that I found really interesting from your blog post regarding male relational aggression. So,
yes.
So I'm just quoting directly from your blog post. You said that over my 6 years of international research, two things become clear. First, what I thought of as mean girl behavior, i.e., social pressure, relational aggression, character assassination, etc., is what we call dirty politics. Relational aggression is a tool used largely by men to compete in a space where having it out doesn't get them what they want, so other methods are used. And you also related that to the neo-Nazis that you hung out with and how they employed techniques like that. And it's something very intriguing that you were told by them. Apparently they said to you, right, I'm quoting from you, confrontation and the truth doesn't work anymore. And that they realized that as men, they need to be smarter. So they have to use psychological manipulation to get things done, create a political group, create a clique, pretend to be inclusive, make politics the key to membership, and make it cool to be in the in-group, right? And then just make fun of people who are hesitant to join. So I guess what I'm asking, having read all that to you, is that it sounds like these techniques essentially are very ubiquitous, insidious, and really how can we attend to them? So that's one. And two, I'm thinking on contralaterally, what if you have a mixed group of marginalized people trying to confront the kind of power dynamics by having that kind of, using that kind of techniques as well?
So this is, I love the transition. So a lot of assumption about toxic masculinity assumes that men are interested in aggression by duking it out, just punching each other in the face and being violent. Clearly that's not true. Aggression is something that's there regardless of whether or not you're male or female. The technique through which you express your aggression changes. And these neo-Nazis figured out something that a lot of people in the medical field haven't figured out in relation to COVID, which is you don't win people over to your ideology by calling them idiots or locking them out of the system. So what they're doing, quite clever, because what they're looking for is they're looking to capitalize on people's uncertainty and vulnerability and give them this sense of certainty along with this masculine role that they wanted to provide. Now, the reality is these techniques are used by, I mean, whoever wants to use them. Your ability to be able to generate an in-group, to then create a sense of identity and value for the members of that in-group, to then strengthen your sense of connectivity by pointing to an out-group and saying they're the bad guys. I mean, that's everything from nation state building to kids in school. Like that's what kids do to each other. So the techniques themselves are not terribly sophisticated as long as they're applied with a sort of level mind, and they work. So this is a weird space that we're in, because here are neo-Nazis doing it, so it must be bad, right? But it's not, because it's a tool and it's just the ideological position that's the problem. It's also the way that people in oppressed, marginalized communities create solidarity. This is the great puzzle of identity. Identity is something that we can telescope in and out depending on what we need it to do. And one of the greatest examples, every single major social rights movement, Black Lives Matter at the moment, but everything that happened before then was also part of that process, this idea of telescoping identity. Who are we? And one of the things that's really interesting about that is a lot of groups that were presumed to to not be fit to survive in that very social Darwinistic sort of sense that Santosh was saying earlier, were able to rediscover their identity and use the same methodology to bring back entire like swaths of cultural practices. Do they authentically resemble the same ones that used to be there before whatever the colonizing process beforehand was? Don't know, maybe not, but it certainly is a powerful way of regenerating community and restoring senses of identity. So it's one of those interesting things. It can be used by neo-Nazis to get young men to do horrible things, but simultaneously it can be used for people who have been repressed for a really long period of time to generate a sense of self and community as well.
Yeah, guys, Ansel, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm, we've been talking a lot about like differences between people, and I'm wondering, in your encounters with neo-Nazis, have you been able to see through to their underlying humanity, like what they have in common with us, and what that's been like for you?
Well, that's where you start. You start with the presumption. I mean, I guess that's the process of training an anthropologist, is to get them to a point where they can begin a conversation through a relativistic perspective. So you don't begin with the label, you begin with the curiosity. So the first time, I mean, I met my neo-Nazis by accident. I was doing parkour research, and a 15-year-old boy invited me to come and hang out with some of his friends. That was literally the invitation. And then I went out into a forest in the middle of, well, it wasn't in the middle, it was like sort of southeast Moscow, because I was in Russia at the time. And there was this group of, I think we had about 25 to 30 neo-Nazis who were not 15, who were like full grown. And my initial thing after I stopped crapping my pants when I realized what was going on was just immediately to go, this is fascinating. Because they invited me to teach them potentially parkour. That's what they wanted from me. They wanted me to show them parkour. And the first thing that they did was they tested me. So there's the classic flinch test, this idea of, do you know who we are? And they showed me some horrible video on YouTube. And when my reaction to that was, well, why did you do that? Instead of, or run away, or you're horrible, I was in. Because one thing that we have to realize is that a neo-Nazi doesn't think that they're a horrible human being. They think they're right. Not only do they think they're right, but they think that they figured out something super important, existentially important for humanity at large. So they don't walk around with eye patches and scars on their face. They have a strong conception that they have the right idea. And when I demonstrated to them that I was curious, when I was curious about their cultural practice and also about who they were, like I just was like, what makes somebody? That was the most intense sort of. I'm like, wow, people like this do exist. What is it that made you like this? And that curiosity was just completely welcome. They were like, let me tell you about our amazing worldview and about our tactics and what we're doing and how smart we are and how organized we are. So yeah, that was sort of the broad thing. And yeah, there is humanity. For me, actually, again, this really connects to Santosh's questions. A lot of them were marginalized. A great deal of them were marginalized people. A great deal of them had come from environments where they have gone through abuse and trauma in the negative sort of Western sense. And what happened was that they were invited into a space by somebody who didn't judge them for it, who said, we will take responsibility for your imperfection. In fact, we think that you're great. And here is a weird thing to say, and I've said it many times. When you're on the inside of the neo-Nazi group, it's freaking nice, because I'm white and they're white and they're cooking barbecue and they're playing ball games and they're roughhousing and they're having conversations about what makes a man. Like it almost feels like a church camp. Like they're trying to create this sense of solidarity, and they're horrible. Like what they do to people is simply horrible. And so, yeah, I saw a lot of the humanity that was in place. And one of the things that I saw, and this is not my observation, but it ended up happening, was you can get to the humanity and you can almost switch off the conditioning simply by remaining curious within that scenario. So I think 3 members of that group reached out to me eventually and wanted to ask me questions that would eventually result in them leaving the group. So it's interesting to see how important these interactions are as well. But yeah, that was really fun and intense field moment. I think it was about a total of about 2 weeks that I spent with that group. But then they were really nice because they sent me links and connections for neo-Nazi groups all across Europe. So I've been paying attention to them for about 6 years. Actually, about 2 years ago, I stopped following it because it was actually taking a toll on my mental health. Watching neo-Nazi groups is harrowing stuff.
Okay. So let me go with my question. Yeah, so I was thinking a lot on the idea of masculinity, and let me share a little bit of my background because
Sure.
I've been involved in the martial arts community, and let's get a bit into politics. So I would consider myself kind of an outcast within the martial arts community. A lot of these people are very conservative, both politically and economically, on the spectrum. Yeah, and I've always felt like I'm the odd one out because I obviously come in with a leftist, progressive kind of point of view, and I have to find my way to fit in. And generally, I feel like you're able to make headway if you share rituals. Going back to the theme that we talk about. So, if I sparred with them, if I did group sessions with them, and essentially there are times also where I've experienced trauma. And it's kind of a positive trauma because when, for example, you spar for the first time, it's never pleasant. You get the first feeling of being punched, getting kicked, and you learn to take it. And I've always felt like that was an essential part of being a martial artist. You have to tolerate getting hit on, otherwise, all that training is off for naught. So in any case, what I'm curious to ask you, Alex, because I'm trying to see whether what you feel about this. I think, like you mentioned just now, that all these conceptions of masculinity are sometimes from traditions way past our time, right? Like 200 years ago. And I was going to ask you that who set this, who designated authorities of symbolism when it comes to this kind of masculinity practices, and whether can we usher in a new era, especially given pop culture where it is right now with the Marvel Cinematic Universe and all this like little, not little, but all this digital media, visual media. Can it lead us to a new path and a new concept of masculinity? One that's a lot more progressive and less tied to patriarchal, traditionalist ideals.
Yeah, the answer to that is yes. And so to go back to the beginning of the question, the people who set the specific sort of ideals of masculinity that many of us in the industrial world sort of live with were very pragmatic people. I mean, there's classic historical notations, particularly within the military traditions, about what is it that they need to define masculinity. And there's great stuff. The church gets involved. They all argue about what a man should be, and they get together and they start propagandizing that. So this is closely connected to the world that we currently live in, where it's not so narrow anymore. It's not just utilitarian. For most of us, we have a process of negotiation that we go through. And the interesting thing about that is masculinity was utilitarian and therefore tightly bounded because the identity had to be connected to a particular task. Most of us have a million tasks that we engage with, and that's good. The more different points of identity we carry within ourselves and present to others, the more sophisticated a representation we generate. And this is one of those wonderful things from empathy studies, the more difficult it is for us to be essentialized by others. So in other words, if you know me as an anthropologist, as a video gamer, as a parkour person, as somebody who likes certain kinds of movies, as somebody who likes dogs, I'm a much more three-dimensional sounding person than if I was just a parkour person or just an anthropologist or all of these things. So I think that this is the moment that we're currently in, where traditional conceptions of masculinity still sort of feed into this sort of uni-identity, unidimensional sort of identity that's tied to this notion of strength or providing or all of this sort of classical sort of stuff. But the more we live in this internet connected world, and the more of us geek out about more of the things that we're deeply passionate about, the more difficult it becomes to sustain those really simple one-dimensional conceptions of masculine identity. So I think that identity is, I'm going to say the most cliche thing in the world right now. Masculinity is having a crisis, which it never stopped having one ever. I'm pretty sure masculinity is just in a state of crisis forever. I think that's just the way it works. But right now, very pointedly so, because it's being threatened by all of these human beings having more than one thing that they're interested in, and the internet bringing them a wealth of information and potential hobby and material that they can engage with. And I think that that's the thing that's really cracking this conception of masculinity right now. And we see the way that different nation states react to that. So within America, the conservatives are very, very upset about the fact that military no longer forces a particular form of identity upon its recruits. And China at the moment is going through a massive drive where they're trying to bring back a conception of masculinity because they're quite concerned about military intervention. So we can see these massive sort of global forces still exerting this pressure, but we've got space to explore ourselves in our downtime as well. So I think that those two things are clashing. This utilitarian sort of externally imposed identity versus a self-defined, self-articulated, multi-dimensional sort of sense of self. I think that that's going to be the thing that challenges us along the way.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to bring up the question of Jordan Peterson. Right, and he's kind of one of the most prominent speakers out there on the crisis of masculinity. And for him, his kind of rallying cry is, to adhere to a much more conservative and patriarchal ideal. His way of looking at men or advising men to be masculine is to be a lot more assertive, to endure suffering. And he actually was quoted saying that the problem with men is the increasing feminization. So I was wondering if you could kind of address that, because he's such a notable figure that we need to have some critical discussion about his ideas.
Yeah, well, I think so the major issue with Peterson is the fact that he takes the entire package for granted. He thinks that so his presumption about the Western world and the way the Western world functions is fixed. The most flexible element of that is the individual. And so what he's doing is he's insisting that every man should just do the thing that he needs to do to be able to fit into this social structure that exists outside of that. And that's, you now have hit upon the classic disagreement between psychologists and anthropologists, because psychologists take the world for granted. It's part of their job to be able to help you fit into your socially prescribed position more successfully. Whereas anthropology begins with the premise that cultural systems are arbitrary adaptations to a long historical environment. So my reaction to Jordan Peterson is, well, my reaction to anybody who listens to Jordan Peterson is, if you love the world, then yeah, okay, go ahead, do what Jordan Peterson tells you. If you think the world as it is now is perfect for you and all you need to do is work on yourself so that you're more successful in it, he's giving you excellent advice. It's not an accident that the vast majority of the people who listen to him are white Anglo males, because that's the people for whom the world is built. Like, that's the kind of thing that really gives them the advantage. So to them, he's giving excellent advice about how to be successful in life. Most other people, the thing that I think most people find either consciously or instinctively perverse about his approach is that, well, maybe the world can be better or different. He has a very antagonistic and somewhat dismissive idea towards people who are trying to be activists to transform the social structure itself. But the social structure is something that we build. It's a social contract. We exist within it by agreement. And certainly you would think that it would be our right to be able to, at the very least, question it if we have the political capacity to do that. And he's just not interested in that kind of stuff. So I have to say, Jordan Peterson as a clinical psychologist is fine. I even read some of his papers about heredity of addiction. He did some wonderful research on alcoholism a while ago. But his worldview is fixed and privileges the privileged in a whole series of ways.
I'm really glad you ended with the last line, because one of the major principles from his book, which I found really distasteful, was the idea about cleaning your own room before you walk on the world. And I'm like, well, who out there is going to claim that they have a perfect room or perfect self, right? I mean, we all have our little flaws or weaknesses that we have to work on, which is a lifelong project. And if we're never going to be satisfied with ourselves, that would never leave us the freedom to actually work on societal change. And it just sounds, as you said, it's a very privileged worldview, because it means you really can carry this careless attitude to the world, and this is somehow justifiable. Yeah. Guys, do you have any other questions you want to bring up? Topics you want to get into?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to ask you your views on something that I'm quite passionate about. So as Douglas mentioned before we started recording, I've been to Burning Man many times. And because of my experiences there, I've become a big believer in the idea of a gift economy, and that resources should flow to where needs are. And you know, gift economies have been quite widespread in indigenous cultures. So a lot of my thinking has been around, okay, what's wrong with this world? It really is patriarchy and the systems of control and domination that come from patriarchy and the mindset of scarcity. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are on whether you see any hope that we could move out of these patriarchal systems into more of, a life-affirming, free flow of resources where there are needs, and more of a mindset of abundance.
Yeah, well, I see, it's interesting because the ideological argument for scarcity is so prevalent. Most people can't imagine. It's one of those ethnocentrisms where people can't imagine an alternative. And I mean, we could talk about things like potluck in North America, where large tribe networks of people would get together and burn their material access every year, give away and burn as much of it as possible, so that conceptions of scarcity and their economies weren't ruled by accumulation. So that's what I'm talking about is North America. And I'm talking about the entire West Coast with indigenous traditions getting together and destroying, and into Canada, destroying huge amounts of wealth, because within that tradition, the presumption was that this wealth would eventually lead to unequal accumulation, conflict, and all that kind of stuff. So giving away and destroying it is a good example. Which was immediately banned by the colonizers, who were so horrified because they couldn't conceive why in the world anybody would destroy material stuff. But to be more recent, I have been on the board. I resigned, I think only about 3 months ago, of a restaurant called Lentil as Anything. And that's been open since 2001. And it's got 6 stores at the moment and operates everywhere. And the way that it works is it's pay as you feel. So the idea of it is that you come in, you eat your meal, and then you leave a donation for what you think it's worth. And the thing that I love about this thing is it's been running successfully as an alternative model of distribution ever since it got founded. And I didn't believe in it. Like when I first saw it, I'm like, these people are suckers. They're going to be taken advantage of. It's going to be gone. But you see that there is actually a will. People are quite interested in the idea of coming up with an alternative practice. And the restaurant was turning over, up until COVID, it was turning over $4 million a year. So it was broadly successful. So when I see things like that, I think it's pretty clear that people are actually interested in being able to look at a system outside of the purview of strict economies. And what's interesting about it is having conversations with people at the restaurant, you're like, well, how do they qualify it? And most people reach for the conception of charity. They're like, yeah, my meal is great, but then I'm paying for somebody else's meal. But it's not that either. Like, we are so bankrupt of the language that we could have about this notion of exchange and scarcity. And I think that if we can tackle that problem, we would be going a long, long way. Because the argument that I've had against the conception of setting up more things like that is that people simply don't believe that they can sustain themselves. And then you just hold it up and say, well, here it is. It's been working for over, like it's in its teens now, and it's still going. And there's an interest in it, and it's growing constantly. I think that that's sort of the turning point where people can just imagine the alternative. It's a positive trauma. We can turn around and say, hey, look, it is possible. We can generate economies that aren't just about scarcity and money. And people seem to be really, really into that. So that's a little bit of hope that I can hold on to, that is very, very tangible because it's right there. And when I ran my classes, that was the model that I used too. I didn't have a set fee. I just said, contribute what you want at the end of it. And that was great. And it paid the bills. So I can't complain about it at all.
But would you
That's
say
great. Thanks for sharing. Yeah.
Would you say these methods are scalable on a large scale? Yeah.
I would say so. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
I think the interesting thing about them is that I think that they're inherently scalable. I think they're actually harder to maintain on a smaller scale. And the reason why is because the big thing that needs to be broken for the scalability of it to happen is for it to be demonstrated. And if you're demonstrating it on a small level, then people might make excuses. They might say you're cooking the book, so you're not doing it right. But the second that you have something that's larger than that and it's sustaining, then you've got a case that would probably turn the hardest capitalist red in the face, because here is the non-allowable reality of an economic system that doesn't look the way that theirs does. And so, do you mind me asking, what kind of stuff did you see at Burning Man that really got you excited about this sort of model?
Yeah, so one of the principles is decommodification. So you can't really pay for anything when you're there. There's no sponsorship, and there's a strong ethos of everyone being there. Your purpose is to share your gifts, express your gifts. I mean, if you were given talents in life, those were gifts given to you. You didn't have to pay for them, so you shouldn't have to charge for them, right? And so the experiences I got was, I mean, in any given day, you would have 30 different separate experiences of people coming up to you, giving you stuff. And some of these things were really synchronicitous. So like you would suddenly be in the middle of a dust storm and magically there's someone appearing out of it. If you were stuck without your goggles and your mask and everything, magically someone's there handing out free masks. Or like at the end of the event one year, we ran out of space to bring our bikes back out, and you're supposed to bring everything out with you. So we were wondering, what are we going to do with all these bikes? And then 2 hours later, like this guy came by in a pickup truck and said, "Hey, I'm collecting bikes to donate to this school, in this town. Do you have any bikes to spare?" And so, that took care of that. And what it made me realize is when you have a whole society that operates on a gift system, it's actually more efficient than capitalist markets. It's way more efficient. So, I mean, it seemed magical, but I think in general, like when people aren't hoarding, then there's more flow. And when there's more flow, things just end up where they need to be.
Yeah. And you see that with Indigenous Australian communities, with the Maori community, this conception of shared circulated resources. So that when one person is rich, everybody is rich. When everybody's poor is really powerful social systems. I love that kind of stuff. And I think the interesting thing about that too is that we're now talking about priming, cultural priming as well. So out of all of the places that I've been to, and I traveled a fair bit of Europe, I spent some time in Japan, and I have to say America is by far the most exotic and strange land that I've visited, because the neoliberal state sort of capitalist conception is so strongly ingrained that they genuinely struggle. And it's not that American people are somehow more greedy or whatever, but they genuinely have an issue imagining an alternative model. And the fact that Burning Man happens in the States is really interesting. So clearly there's that yearning to be able to find that space within which these communities can come up. I think it's really important. I think that it is possible. I think it's important to be able to publicize them and give examples of alternative and existing economies. And look, here is another example. Lumpen populations, in other words, the poorest, addicts, homeless people across the world function within that kind of commodified exchange system. And the reason why is because there's no security. Class distinctions. I'll give you an example from Australia that also applies to a lot of other English-speaking places. Middle-class people generally have a much stronger emphasis on self-care and low stress, get on with your day sort of attitudes, while as working class people have a very strong emphasis on the conception of loyalty and keeping your head down and doing the work in a particular way. And these two work cultures exist parallel to each other, quite often unaware of each other's functioning, but they're happening within the same social sphere. And one is significantly more dependent on circulatory economies, and the other one is significantly more individualistic and capitalist. So yeah, these systems already are here and they exist underneath our noses. We just usually stigmatize them along with the people who practice that kind of thing. There's a blatant denial of reality. So America is a wonderful example because they're just like, yeah, as far as we're concerned, Sweden, Scandinavia doesn't exist. Like the place that has the most liberal sort of general socialistic policies, instead of acknowledging that that system could possibly work, they just go, oh no, those countries, as far as I'm concerned, those countries don't exist to me, or they're too small, or come up with a dismissive thought terminating cliche. So I think the biggest challenge is articulating these ideas and demonstrating their presence. Not so much setting them up again because they're already here. They're operating quite often right in front of us. We just often fail to notice them.
Santosh, you want to ask a question?
No, I think nature is a perfect example of a gift economy. The sun shines without asking, like, what do I get in return, right? And then there's this whole circulation from the sun to water evaporating into rain, and rain circulating down. Trees, trees, they take in our carbon dioxide, yeah, and then they give out their oxygen, which we take in. That's like a perfect gift from nature to all of us. So I feel like nature is already role modeling a lot of this gift economy, and it's right under our noses. It's so beautiful to watch. Yeah, we don't even need to go to Burning Man or go to Australia, but it's right under our noses. Yeah, and I feel, and someone did tell me that we all grew up in the gift economy because when we were babies, our mothers modeled that to us because we were the most dependent, and we received gifts after gifts after gifts with no expectation of anything in return. So we already have that modeled to us since young. So I think it's perfectly possible to imagine an economy that's based on giftivism.
And not only that, but it's incredible to see how much wealth there is when you look at ecology, like a wealth of energy. And then we still have this bizarre habit as human beings where we will go and we will find a forest that's 3 to 4 million years completely and totally petrified, and we'll pump it up in the form of oil and be like, look at this free stuff we got. So clearly we've got a bit of an issue to deal with when it comes to human beings need to get better at the giving part, and we need to give to more than just our own offspring. I find it a consistently underwhelming argument. And I say this as a parent, when somebody turns around and says, oh, you know that they're a good person because they're nice to their kids. And I'm like, everyone's nice to their kids. That's biology. Like that's the selfish gene. We're talking about an absolutely selfish behavior. If you can be nice to the environment, if you can be nice to people who are outside of your immediate kinship, that is a significant sort of demonstration. But if you think the ultimate virtue is being nice to your own kids, congratulations. Probably the greatest person who's ever been alive is a deer, because most other mammals have exactly the same habit, the desire to protect their own biological offspring. It's a question of extending that empathy. And there's a wonderful book I'd recommend, it's quite old now, by Jeremy Rifkin called The Empathic Civilization. I don't know whether or not any of you have encountered it, but it's beautiful, and it's about that, the idea of progressing technology as being a scaffolding for enhancing and increasing the range of our empathy. Beautiful, very hopeful book that also is quite realistic about how easily our empathy can collapse during times of stress. I'm sorry to say, but I'm probably going to want to go to bed in about 5 minutes or so. That's all right.
No, so that's
2 o'clock in the morning now.
No. So that's why I've actually been trying to get Santosh and Ongsu to lead with their last questions. So Alex, thanks so much for staying up with us. I think it's been about close to 2 hours. So we really, really appreciate you taking your time to sit in and to talk so much and beautifully and eloquently about everything we've discussed, whether it's masculinity, anthropology, gift economies. So let's just close with you, just giving viewers a sense of where they can contact you. You have, I believe, some courses that you'd like to advertise. So please plug in.
Sure. And thank you for having me and for the wonderful, thoughtful questions from all of you. I feel like if there's a next time, we'll sit down and we'll decide of a particular series of stories, because I've just run around and given you jack of all trades coverage of everything. There's actually fieldwork behind most of the stuff that I'm talking about, which we barely got to touch. I think we just talked about the neo-Nazis. And yeah, I still periodically run anthropology courses. About to start a 3-week intensive on trauma, cross-cultural perspectives of trauma, the stuff that we just sort of covered, but more in depth. And there's Anthropology 101 and Anthropology of Embodiment that I run periodically. If you want to know when they are, I don't know yet, because I think probably I'll kick one off in about 5 weeks, but I take them up as I see fit and when I have time and energy. If you'd like to know, email me, if you don't mind attaching my email to your description, but it's a.pavlotski@gmail.com.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, we definitely will do that. So I'll definitely leave some contact details for our viewers to find you. And I'm very sure, if they went through this interview with you, they would be delighted and interested to take up a course with you. Definitely, I'm giving my endorsement that anyone that's interested to hear what Alex has to say. And furthermore, it's really intriguing, like the way you deliver your courses with documentaries and other visual material. I mean, it makes the session not feel like a dry lecture. Yeah, so let me just say that for the viewers, that Alex is a very engaging teacher as well. So anyway, we're going to come to a close. And Alex, yeah, I actually do agree with you. If we do run another interview with you, we can dive into something more in depth. You have something about popular culture that I may want to run through with you. So let's see whether that can come up in the future. So with that being said, thanks a lot for tonight. And we come to a close. Good night, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah.